Okay, this video addresses some of the ideas expressed in Yamato's Something About the Subject is Hard to Name. Now we see in her article what Yamato is talking about is the issues of racism, in particular individual racism. She tries to get us to understand that racism is a form of oppression that is both systemic, that means there are systems, that racism works within a certain type of system, and it's also institutional. So let's say we have the educational system, the economic system, and in turn we have the schools and the banks and lending companies. That the educational system and economic system itself was constructed using racism as a way to determine who has access to economic mobility and who does not. And in turn, these systems have been integrated in the very institutions of our society, like education, banks, and loan companies. She also wants to get us to understand this idea that oppression works, and say if we look at what Fry was saying, this kind of double bind, this kind of being locked in this kind of birdcage, that we begin, many people who have to deal with this type of oppression on a regular basis begin to internalize their oppression. That she defines internalized oppression as the target group are emotionally, physically, and spiritually battered until they believe their oppression is deserved. Let me say that again. Internalized oppression, as defined by Yamato, is where the target group are emotionally, physically, and spiritually battered until they believe their oppression is deserved. She goes on to talk about that and to give us a definition of racism. Yamato's definition of racism is a systemic, institutional mistreatment of one group of people based on racial heritage. Again, Yamato defines racism as a systemic, institutional mistreatment of one group of people based on racial heritage. Now, I can't remember right now if I had mentioned this before, but when we look at this, what we see is what's missing is the issues that we generally assign to what creates racism: ignorance, fear, and hatred. That's not part of Yamato's definition, and it wasn't part of Memi's definition. And the idea of how we assign value to difference. Like I said in the other video, and I just want to repeat this just to be sure we understand it. In today's society, ignorance, I believe, can no longer be used as a reason for racist beliefs. That if you spend any time in this country, you are exposed to the idea that racism is wrong, and racial discrimination is something we need to put an end to. You've been introduced to that idea. So I don't believe ignorance can no longer be used as a reason for racism. And fear and hatred don't cause racism. Racism causes fear and hatred. Now, I don't want to go into too much about the types of individual racism that she writes about in her article. I'll just bring them up and name them again. She identifies 4 types of individual racism: aware blatant, aware covert, unaware unintentional, and unaware self-righteous. Aware blatant is that overt racism that we assign to, say, the KKK. Aware covert racism is that person who hides their racism. Unaware unintentional is when you don't know that you're being racist, and when you are being racist. And unaware self-righteous is when you are trying to say, for example, and this isn't limited to this example, whites telling blacks what it is to be black. So those are the 4 types of individual racism that she's identified. I've identified a 5th type. A 5th type that I call aware behind the back. Let me say that again. On top of the 4 aspects of individual racism that Yamato describes, I've identified a 5th type of racism: aware behind the back racism. That aware behind the back racism is that the person never says anything, any racist ideas or any racist comments around the person of color they're racist against, or around the person they're racist against, until that person is gone. And when that person and when the racist person goes back among their friends, then the racist jokes and the racist comments are brought up. So again, aware behind the back racism is that type of racism when the person won't say anything racist around the person that they feel racism towards, or that they're racist against. They wait till that person is no longer there, and then they start saying the racist jokes and the racist comments. Another thing that I want to address with Yamato and kind of take this idea, that like Frey's idea of oppression, that if we can start to claim that everybody is oppressed, it robs the significance, or it robs oppression of its significance. Yamato brings this idea that in such a way that we can sit there and see we can all be racist. But if we can all be racist, like the term oppression, a racist, the idea of racism loses its significance. It's important to understand, well, yes, there are those ideas that we all can be racist, but what's important to understand is that we can all be racist in the same way. So let me say that again. While it can be said and can be true that we all can be racist, we cannot all be racist in the same way. And the way I distinguish this idea is what I call effective racism. Now, effective racism is the ability to create a deeply internalized sense of otherness in the individual or community. Let me say this again. I define effective racism as the ability to create a deeply internalized sense of otherness within the person or within the community. Now, one way to see how this process works, or how effective racism influences people, and this is what I do in my class, so again, it's not going to translate well, is that once I've mentioned this ability to create a deeply internal sense of otherness, I walk up to say to a black student, and I ask that black student, would it bother you if I was to call you a nigger? And most of the black students sit there and say, yes, it would bother me if you were to call me a nigger. Then I walk up to a white student and I sit there, does it bother you if I was to call you a cracker? And in most cases, whites would sit there and say, no, it does not bother me if you were to call me a cracker. This, to me, allows to see this idea of this deeply internalized sense of otherness. The reason why most whites are not effective or are not offended when they are called a cracker is because blacks have never had control over the ISAs of our society to create a deep sense of otherness within the white. They were never able to get whites to kind of internalize this impression as being inferior to blacks. Where whites have had the ability to create this deeply internalized sense of otherness within blacks, especially when we look at issues of slavery and we look at issues of Jim Crow. So effective racism, that ability to create a deeply internalized sense of otherness, I think can be seen in the way most blacks get offended if they were to be called a nigger. And most whites are not offended when they are called cracker. The ability to create that deep sense of otherness is the reason why one group of people get offended and another group of people do not. Now, for me, effective racism, in order for it to create this deeply internalized sense of otherness, there are 4 elements that comprise effective racism. 1, historical construction. We have to remember that the racism that we're dealing with in this country wasn't created by people of color. We didn't get around sometime in the 17th or 18th century. and say, let's come up with a system that's going to discriminate against us and benefit whites in ways that won't benefit us. We have to understand that the racism we deal with in this country was largely constructed by whites to serve the needs of whites. And that when people of color get involved in exercising racism or in these racist beliefs, it is out of our influence by whiteness on these different racial or racist stereotypes that we play into. So again, the first element of effective racism is historical construction. The second element of effective racism is institutional and systemic support. We see in terms of the legal system how excuse me, how blacks are arrested much more than whites, and how blacks are given longer sentences and harsher sentences than whites. We don't have that systemic support. People of color aren't in control of the systems and institutions of our society. Third, it has to affect future generations. My children being born abroad are almost certain to deal with the type of racism that I dealt with growing up. Most white, or not most, but many whites can put their children in a position where they may never have to deal with what's called reverse racism on any regular basis, the way my children are going to have to deal with racism on a regular basis. So again, the third element of effective racism is institutional and systemic support. People of color don't have control over the institutions and systems of our society to support their racism and the way whites have had control over the institutions and systems of our society that supports their racism. Fourth and finally, the fourth and final element of effective racism is the ability to affect the entire population of a group. We know that in our society, in our history, people of color have never been able to enslave whites. We've never been able to get whites to sit at the back of the bus. We've never been able to get whites to accept less for their labor. We've never been able to institute a system of racism that affects the entire population of whites, the way whites have been able to have control of the institutions and deal with racism in such a way that it has an effect on the entire community of people of color, whether they're black, Asian, Latino, or Native American. So again, effective racism is that type of racism that allows us to understand, while we all can be racist, we all can't be racist in the same way. And the reason why is because effective racism, that ability to create a deeply internalized sense of otherness, and again, you can kind of look at Madrid's article, and we'll talk more about that, where he talks about being othered in our society. Effective racism, the ability to create a deeply internalized sense of otherness. It must be, one, historically constructed. Two, it must be institutional, have institutional and systemic support. It must affect future generations. And it must have the ability to affect the entire population. When we look at those four elements, we see that while people of color can be racist and like whites can be racist, we can't be racist in the same way whites can be racist. Now, finally, I want to bring in one last thing, and at the end of her article, so how we deal with this. If racism is such a bad thing in our society, what are some ways that we can address it? And she gives us some proactive ways to address issues of racism. First and foremost, she says we have to acknowledge racism exists. That begins by getting rid of the idea that we're a colorblind society, or that we ever want to be a colorblind society. We want to recognize difference. What we want to do is move from being a colorblind society to a value-blind society. We want to erase the value we've assigned to race, not erase race itself. We want to recognize racial differences, but we want to subvert the value that's been placed on these racial differences. We do this on two levels, your personal and social. It's going to be hard to affect or end the institutional or systemic racism if you first haven't dealt with the way your racist lens has influenced your racial perception in the first place. And once you begin to eliminate the influence that the racist lens has on your racial lens, you can begin to have a greater effect in ending racism on these larger institutional, social, or systemic issues. Challenge oppression. Don't sit quietly by when you hear somebody say something racist. I had a student who talked about, who worked at this place at the mall, that she was told by her employers to keep an eye out for Latinos because of the issues of stealing, that they're thieves, racial profiling. If this happens to you, challenge it. Now, you can't challenge it every day. You have to learn to pick your battles. But if you never challenge it, your silence is only giving consent for racism to continue. If you never challenge racial oppression, your silence is a form of consent that says it's okay to oppress people because of their race. Is educate yourself about racism through research. Don't use people of color's backs as a bridge to their relationship to race and racism. This is talking about a dominance group's inability to take the time to educate themselves about racism and racial oppression. This means that you can't be lazy. You just can't accept it. Look, I don't know how any of you are going to take this thing, but this is the way I brought it up to my class, and it's just an idea I want you to think about. So many times I hear parents say, I'll do anything I can for my children. If that's true, then one of the responsibilities of a parent is to challenge the oppression that their child either might benefit from or might suffer from. So for me, when a parent says, I'll do anything I can for my children, but I don't see them challenging oppression, then my first initial reaction is that no, you're not willing to do anything for your children. You're willing to do most things for your children, but you're not willing to do everything for your children. In the sense of the dominant groups of access to racial oppression or to racism is for them to appreciate what people of color who help them deal with their frustration, who help them move towards this idea of how do we address racism in a more effective way? How do we end racial oppression? So go back over the last part of her article to look at these proactive solutions and see which one of these proactive solutions you can incorporate into your life. Okay, thank you.